Thank you for coming. I'm Abigail Rogerson-Woodall from the Shakespeare Institute, University of Birmingham, and I'm delighted to be joined by Angie Wootton from the Department of Disability, Inclusion and Special Needs in the University of Birmingham, Tracy Irish from the Royal Shakespeare Company, and actor and director and RSC Associate Artist, Charlotte Arrowsmith. Today we're going to be talking about our project, Signing Shakespeare, a collaboration between the University of Birmingham and the Royal Shakespeare Company. So just to give some context, we'll begin by explaining how we became involved in the project and what prompted its development. So when my son was about 2 months old, he was diagnosed with auditory neuropathy, which is a rare form of deafness with an uncertain prognosis. This was a shock to two hearing parents, both of whom work with words and speech, and we quickly became aware of the statistics. Deaf children, of whom there are nearly 46,000 in England, are severely disadvantaged in the classroom. Only 30.6% achieve a strong GCSE pass, so that's grade 5 or above, in both English and maths, compared with 48.3% of children with no special educational needs. Many are not even entered for GCSE English. When the company definitely came a week of research and development at sea, I was in the rehearsal room. It was one of the most inspiring weeks I've spent. They were working on creating a version of Macbeth using British Sign Language and what was referred to as iconic signs. So, for example, using the sign sleep rather than sleep, or for dog rather than dog. This was partly in order to create a production that might be accessible to both deaf and hearing audiences. I was struck by the clarity, the energy, and the quality of the work. The process of translating Shakespeare into BSL, as Charlie will explain more, is one of interpretation. It's a highly creative process that involves an in-depth analysis of what's being communicated. A few months later, we were introduced to Angie, who was to be our child's teacher of the deaf. We were told that we'd been matched particularly because of Angie's interest in the use of drama with deaf children. Angie, it turns out, was a colleague at Birmingham University in the Department of Disability, Inclusion and Special Needs. Angie then seemed an obvious addition to the team when we began discussing a potential project on teaching Shakespeare to deaf children. And I'm now going to hand over to Angie.
I was delighted to be invited to join the project. Although there's surprisingly little research on the efficacy of using drama with deaf children, all my working life as a teacher of deaf children, I've used drama as an educational tool and witnessed how successful it can be. And this has been with children of all ages and all levels of deafness. Some years ago, I wrote a book with Jackie O'Hanlon, Director of Education at the RSC, on using drama with deaf children. And now that I coordinate the course leading to a qualification as teacher of the deaf, I'm in a position to promote the use of drama with deaf children and young people. Given the way that deaf children use their bodies to communicate their stories, there seems to be a logic in using drama with them. It may be even that the visuospatial element of drama dovetails neatly with the adapted cognition of deaf learners. Tracy will talk more about deaf children and embodied cognition shortly.
I was invited to join the project because of my experience in developing RSC approaches for the wide range of students in mainstream classrooms. We call these approaches rehearsal room pedagogy because they are based in the activities and thinking that actors do in a rehearsal room to explore a play. I was interested at least as much in what we could learn from the deaf community about the physical nature of language, as in how we could help deaf young people to access Shakespeare. As our project grows, I am more and more convinced that a great deal of learning from this project can inform the RSC's work with all students, in exploring how the rhythms and metaphors from Shakespeare's language find visceral, visual and physical expression in performance.
So, I joined the project how? I joined the project because I was working with the RSC for the 7th season in 2019-20. So, the organisations asked me to join the project to see and work with the team in terms of translation. I was really interested to be a part of this project and to help with directing the deaf actors and to create the Macbeth synopsis and to create a suitable translation for deaf young people. I was really interested in exploring that process. As we went through the project, I was really excited to see what we could achieve and able to use my experience from working with the Royal Shakespeare Company. And when I grew up, I had very few experiences like this. I can remember at school during GCSE English. Yes, but how could, with a hearing teacher, explain to me as a deaf young person, that was really difficult. And of course, back there, people didn't know how. They didn't know the different routes of translation. Whereas now, we've been really exploring it as we continue to do so. When I was a young person, people didn't realise that. And we're still developing new projects and concepts. I learnt a lot more at the University of Reading, finding out about theatre art, education and deaf studies. And that really showed me a broad way of processing and understanding performance and deaf culture and theatre, plus taught me about education. So that meant me myself could become a theatre facilitator and a deaf lead in educating young people so they could look up to me and I could be a role model. And that's what I really want to explore more with this Signing Shakespeare project as it develops. How do we translate that text? Well, I will explain to you how that translation process happens. So, we have the original text, the Old English Shakespearean text. So hearing people can already translate that text and find that meaning. But for deaf people, we need to change that Shakespearean English into modern English. It then gets translated into BSL, into British Sign Language. So then we have that deaf language. And then we have to we can't just use that translation on stage. Hearing actors can just voice the text. They can continue speaking that text on stage. No, it has to be changed again. You might change your intonation, you might change the pitch. And it's the same for deaf actors. So, including that part of the process, we have to translate the text into perhaps sign poetry or VV, visual vernacular. I will explain a bit more about the types of sign language later. But there are 4 parts of that process, 4 different ways in order to achieve a full translation. So within the rehearsal room, I have to look at my character. I have to look at the character direction, the relationships with the other characters. And translation is never fixed. It's a work in progress. It means you've got hearing culture and deaf culture, and they meet together in the middle. They meet halfway.
So really, the first questions to ask are, why is a project necessary? What's the problem for deaf children in accessing and enjoying Shakespeare? Even if they can't hear it too well, isn't the best approach to give them the written text so that they can read it and understand it that way? Well, let's unpack that a bit to start with. Firstly, we need to recognise the great variety and range that is indicated by the simple term deaf children. They are very far from a homogeneous group, and so what applies to one child does not apply to another. Some children and adults would identify themselves as having a hearing loss. They don't hear as well as others, but with the benefit of hearing aids, can largely access what hearing people can. Others, proud of their heritage, culture and language, BSL, would identify themselves as belonging to the deaf community and to be deaf. Other people are somewhere in between. There are native deaf signers and coders, or children of deaf adults. Deafness has many different causes, some of which resolve over time or can be treated, and some can't be. And so we have permanent, non-permanent, and fluctuating hearing losses. So there is a huge range. This is the sort of chart that a clinician uses to plot a person's hearing, but with added symbols. On the horizontal axis, you will see frequency of sound, how low or high in pitch a sound is. And on the vertical axis, you will see volume, measured in decibels. The lower down the diagram a person's hearing is plotted, the deafer they are. You will see the 4 different bands of hearing: mild, moderate, severe, and profound. Deaf can refer to children with a very mild hearing loss. For instance, they might not hear a whisper or a tap dripping. And there are children with a moderate, severe, or even a profound hearing loss, such that they wouldn't hear an aeroplane taking off beside them, or a rock band. Deafness can impact on development of a child's spoken language, and in turn on their learning and the development of literacy. But the greatest danger to any deaf child is impoverished early language, that's signed or spoken. In order to develop age-appropriate spoken language, a child needs hearing aids or cochlear implants early in their life to access sounds. In order to develop effective sign language, the child needs early exposure to it. If this is achieved, language flourishes, so making development in other areas possible. Now, coming back to being able to read text, some research indicates that proficiency in sign language is a strong indicator of developing reading skills. But a relatively small number of deaf children sign in the UK, some 29%, which may come as a surprise. Other research indicates that the most important predictors for the development of reading skills are a child's vocabulary and their phonemic awareness, being able to distinguish between individual speech sounds. Both of these can be affected in deaf children, and this is why deaf children's literacy skills are often lower than typically hearing children, as Abigail mentioned earlier. This is why putting the text of a Shakespeare play in front of a deaf child, instead of listening to the words, works no better. And what about Shakespeare in particular? Apart from the language itself, which is of a different age and therefore unfamiliar, there are the plots, some of which are quite complicated, and there are the literary devices that Shakespeare uses. Onomatopoeia, for example, relies on a knowledge of environmental sound and how words sound. You see the issue for a deaf child. Alliteration. Again, it works because hearing people recognise the pattern of phonemes and the sound it makes, but deaf children are less likely to hear the phonemes. The same is true of assonance and rhyme. Puns, rhythm, imagery, metaphors, and similes all involve playing with words and sounds and meaning, and that can be more difficult for deaf children. At first, this looked a real dilemma, but as we progress through our presentation, we hope to explain how this world was opened up through working with a range of practitioners, both deaf and hearing. Some devices rely on the area of knowledge we call theory of mind, like empathy and dramatic irony, and Abigail's going to talk about theory of mind in a minute. So we were mindful of the issues, and the mission was on to try to find ways through and to open up this astonishing world to deaf children.
Theory of mind is something in which we became very interested in the early stages of this project, since it's something with which some deaf children can struggle, possibly due to the fact that they don't overhear so many conversations, or due to the way in which adults may communicate with a deaf child. Theory of mind first emerged as a topic of interest in the 1970s, defined by Premack and Woodruff as the ability to impute mental states to oneself and others. In 2014, Westby and Wilson further clarified the different types of theory of mind. They also identified various stages and orders of theory of mind. So first order being the ability to think about what somebody else is thinking or feeling. Second order, including the ability to think about what someone is thinking or feeling about what someone else is thinking or feeling. And higher level, involving the recognition of lies, sarcasm, figurative language idioms, and multiple embeddings of thinking or feeling. Now, there's no published work on drama in deaf children and theory of mind, but we did consult Helen Chilton at Man University, who works on the use of books developing theory of mind, and notably theory of mind with deaf children. We all agreed that drama, and in particular Shakespeare, might be a productive avenue for looking at this topic. In the simplest terms, in a workshop situation, to inhabit the character of Macbeth is to make decisions about how that character is thinking and feeling, and to understand that Macbeth has thoughts and feelings that you, hopefully, don't have. But with Shakespeare, it goes beyond this, partly due to the level of dramatic irony, the way in which a character can say something to one character and then immediately turn to the audience to tell us they're actually thinking or feeling something quite different, or the way in which the audience often knows something that a character does not, and therefore the audience has to hold both these thoughts in their mind at once. The next stage of research was to look at current RSE provision in order to assess how accessible or otherwise it might be to deaf children.
There are key points common across RSE rehearsal room pedagogy that build on established good pedagogical practice. These principles might be summarised as inviting in a child's prior knowledge, experience and imagination and co-constructively extending their knowledge and skills. Asking open questions to encourage dialogic debate and critical thinking. Making texts accessible and enjoyable to encourage understanding and promote future engagement. And working as a pro-social ensemble to solve the real-world problems of communicating a text to an audience. Through the activities that we have developed, these principles have been proven to benefit the learning of young people from many backgrounds and abilities. However, adaptations to exercises are always important, depending on context, and particularly with special educational needs and disabilities groups. So through our initial research with deaf actors and teachers of the deaf, some basic problems with some of our common RSE exercises became obvious. For example, in a workshop with hearing students, we often feed in instructions to follow or lines to speak as students move around the space. With deaf students, however, instructions must be given with all students looking at you so that they can get the visual cues they need, whether lip reading or watching the signing of the interpreter. Also, we often use listening exercises, such as asking young people to close their eyes and echo keywords as the speech is read aloud. Or we ask them to stand back to back with their partner to read their lines. Exercises like this are problematic with deaf students and can make already vulnerable young people feel even more vulnerable. And also, as Angie explained, giving deaf students written text is not always helpful, as deaf students may have a range of additional disadvantages in reaching the reading ability of their hearing peers. Many common exercises, however, such as inhabiting characters and settings through freeze frames and multisensory experiences, or finding meaning through physical gestures and rhythm, are as accessible and useful for deaf students as they are for hearing students. Working with deaf practitioners was crucial in developing our understanding of the bridges to be discovered in communicating across hearing and deaf cultures, in terms of more focus on visual rather than oral communication, as Charlie was describing. The general principle of learning by doing is a standard pedagogical practice for teachers of the deaf, as Angie mentioned, and fits neatly with rehearsal room pedagogy. This relates to the principle of embodied cognition, which became another key concept for our research along with theory of mind. Embodied cognition is a term that captures increasing scientific understanding that, far from being rational minds carried around in unruly emotional bodies, all of our thinking derives from the patterns and associations laid down in our brains from our emotionally coloured sensory contact with the world around us. All this sensory experiential information adds up to create each person's perspective of how they individually understand the world, their unique mental schema of the world around them. As highly social animals, we have evolved to be strongly influenced by our contact with other human beings, hence the importance of theory of mind in our development. Rehearsal room pedagogy taps into humans' innate embodied cognition, how we learn through our whole body, and how our comparisons and considerations of the ideas and perspectives of others in our environment impacts on and develops our personal mental schema of the world. So, principles of co-constructive pedagogy, theory of mind and Helen Chilton's work, embodied cognition, and all of Angie's understanding of the developmental issues for deaf children and the wide range of what being deaf can mean, all fed into a theoretical framework informing how we then worked with deaf practitioners and students and teachers of the deaf to create Shakespeare workshops for deaf young people.
Because we were aware of the different communication modes and abilities of deaf children and young people, we were keen to trial our materials in a range of settings. The staff of 2 contrasting schools for deaf children agreed to be involved early on in the process. Now, the first of these was Braidwood School in Birmingham, a day school for secondary age pupils, where the predominant language being used is BSL. Spoken and written English is also used, alongside sign-supported English. Charlie's going to say a bit more about these different sign languages in a moment. The young people we worked with here were in year 10, that's 14 and 15-year-olds. The second school was a residential school in Berkshire, Mary Hare School, which is a secondary school for deaf pupils who are taught orally. Listening and speech are encouraged in the classroom. These young people were around 13 and 14 years old and in year 9. And finally, we trialled the materials with slightly younger children at Elmfield School, Bristol, primary and secondary aged children. They ranged in age from 9 to 12 years old. Again, BSL and English languages, including sign-supported English, are used.
I did a week of research and development at the RSC on Macbeth with deaf actor Stephen Collins and sign language interpreter and actor Becky Barry. We concentrated on story and in particular sequencing, which deaf young people can find difficult. Character, so inhabiting character and understanding different perspectives, and basic vocabulary. But we also didn't shy away from features of the language: rhythm, antithesis, metaphor, simile, imagery, and personification, some of which sign language can express very vividly. We also thought about how we might be able to deal with elements of sound and meaning, so assonance, alliteration, and onomatopoeia. One of the things that became clear, both in our conversations with Braidwood and in the R&D, was how enormously valuable it would be for deaf young people to be able to see some of the scenes in their own first language. In many cases, this is British Sign Language, and for some, SSE, Sign-Supported English. One of the highlights of the R&D week was seeing Becky, Stephen, and Rachel, our interpreter, sign the first witches scene in BSL, SSE, and visual vernacular. We came to realise in the process of the R&D that it would have been so beneficial to have been able to have more deaf practitioners involved, and this was something that we immediately set out to do. The next step was to commission a pilot film of the first witches scene using deaf actors.
So that's when I joined the project. But before I carry on talking about this, I just want to explain to you a few things about the different languages and the way that deaf people communicate. So I think it's really important that you're aware that there is BSL, British Sign Language. And what is it? So it's the way a lot of deaf people communicate. So it's signing. But sign language has its own context. It's the same as it has its own linguistics, its own grammar. So for example, when I sign what? So in BSL, if I was speaking, I'd say, what are you talking about? Or what is your name? So you change the grammar, you change that structure. The word order, it's different. Have what? You also have sign-supported English. So that is like signing and speaking alongside each other. It can be a bit like this, patting your head and stroking your stomach at the same time. It can be very difficult, but some deaf children prefer that because they have a bit of hearing and they grow up oral, and they, in terms of written English, sign-supported English can help them understand everything. You also have total communication. So what does that mean? So it means everything. You have signing and speech and reading. You might use drawing to show examples. You also use gesture. You use everything. All works together. There's not one way. You use different parts of lots of different types of communication to match that child's needs. We also have quite a new development, which is international sign language. So I'm sure you're all aware of this, but all the way around the world, deaf people are signing. And do they all use one language? No. But they do have international sign language, which includes a lot of iconic signs and gesture. So it means that everyone can communicate internationally. And that's quite recent. And we also have VV, which is visual vernacular. And what is this? Let me explain. It has its own rules. For example, it has the repetition. It uses the rhythm of 3 as a structure. So for example, like this would be walking. You walk 3 times. You can't carry on and just keep repeating. You have to work to this poetic structure. Or you have your signing frame. You can't just lean and take up more space. It's very specific with the rules that it uses. And I'm sure a lot of people have heard this word before, Makaton. Now, Makaton is not suitable for deaf children. It's more suitable for children with additional needs. Maybe people are hearing and they need additional language support. It's not specific for deaf children. If you were trying to sign something to me in Makaton, I just wouldn't understand. I wouldn't know what you were saying because it's separate from BSL. Makaton is usually used, it borrows signs from BSL. It borrows elements and changes them and adapts them to make it suitable and more visual for those with learning disabilities. So we have all these different types of sign language. And in this project, we also, in signing Shakespeare, we were talking about how to translate Shakespeare. So let me explain to you, like I did before, about that translation process. So how can we make sign language, Shakespeare accessible to deaf people? How can we use their communication methods and make sure it matches them? So we use 3 different ways. So for example, we used BSL, we used SSE, and we used VS. Now V or VSS. Now what is VS or VSS? Well, let me explain. So VV is visual vernacular. So we wanted to adapt this into a slightly new process. So it's like visual Shakespeare or visual signing Shakespeare. And how do we achieve this? Through a process of discussion. We didn't just decide one idea. We had to explore it and really discuss the meaning and make sure we agreed that this would work really well for deaf young people. When we agreed with the meaning, then we were like, yes, we'll use this sign. And we use this as an option. So it means children have options of how they see Shakespeare, whichever matches them. Or if they see one version, the BSL, and they don't understand, they could use the sign-supported English. Or they could try the VS and see if they understood that. So it means we could achieve that most young people would be watching the BSL, some children would be watching the SSE, the sign-supported English, and some would watch the VS, but in 3D, all of these languages. Oh no, I'm sorry, I think my internet just dropped out. Sorry about that. Zoom and digital life, eh? Okay, so let me go back. I was just explaining about the 3 different options we were using as communication tools for deaf young people. And it's really important to be free and to give them that choice. And we can show you some examples now.
when shall we three meet again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain?
That would be Aaron, the second son.
Where's the place?
There to meet with Macbeth.
Fair is foul, and foul is fair. Hover through the fogs and filth the air.
These films became central to the two-lesson pilot scheme of work that we created for the first act of Macbeth. The initial workshops that we did at Braidwood and Mary Hare proved a very useful but steep learning curve. And our subsequent workshops at Elmfield benefited hugely from the trials of what games and activities best led to successful learning outcomes. For example, we found games of becoming soldiers and physically creating the events of the battle between Scotland and Norway at the start of the play very useful. Tapping into their embodied cognition in this way helped to establish the context for Macbeth's actions and to explore the theory of mind issues of who knows what and when in the play. In this video of our very first workshop with the Braidwood students, you will see three groups performing the first witches scene. The first group are Witch 1, the second group you see a Witch 2, and the third group a Witch 3. You might notice how the students adopt some ideas directly from the film of the witches, the hurly-burly, for example, adapt others, you can see the flag there, to show that the battle is won, and they invent their own, as you can see here, the comically throwing the jacket over the sun as night's covering. Just coming up again, you'll see this again. Something However, that did not work well in our first workshops was showing a clip from the recent filmed version of the RSC stage production. This included a BSL interpreter signing in the corner of the screen, as well as subtitles, and that was on top of action that was often hard to make out in detail because it was all quite dark. It quickly became apparent that this was cognitive overload. There was too much information on the screen to keep the students' attention. Their disconnection to this film was in marked contrast to the attention and enjoyment that they had shown towards the specially created film of the witches played by deaf actors. And this was really important feedback for the RSC in providing accessibility for deaf young people to their broadcasts. And for us, it confirmed the importance of putting the films with deaf actors and deaf creatives at the heart of our project. So we went on to identify 10 key moments in the play that we wanted to create films for, and would create a package of activities and resources around. And we were very fortunate to be able to work with Charlie as our director and Becky Barry as her assistant director to create these films. In future, we hope to work with more deaf creatives because of how important it is to involve them in creating work that truly speaks to deaf young people. On this occasion, we did make a great choice to work again with Braidwood School, and we were thrilled to have 3 of the students who had taken part in our pilot workshops to play the apparitions in our film of the second set of prophecies. In this film, you will see one of those performances.
So for me being involved in the Braidwood School project, it was really important to lead that. So with myself and Becky Barry as assistant director, we were really exploring the theme of the apparition and really exploring those characters, the character relationships, looking at what the scene meant, and exploring the drama and how it developed within the scene to really support the young people's understanding. We wanted to know the mood, what was the colour of the scene, what was the background, what was the set, what was the landscape like at night. And we really discussed all these elements through games and activities in lots of different ways. And it was beautiful. And you could see the young deaf people looking up to role models, other facilitators who were deaf. And that was so important. But when deaf young people see deaf people leading, it means they can understand and they really match that language that we share. And that's vital. Also, they can see deaf professionals in education and they see that perspective, and it's really surprising. And to see those reactions is fantastic. And they start to understand, I can do things. It raises those aspirations. They know what they can achieve. They think if these deaf role models can, and they are all excited to achieve as well. So it was beautiful to see the young people developing those ideas and directing. And it really made me realise, like within the team, we had a great discussion about the project and about the films and making the clips. And actually, it would be better to use deaf creatives to be able to make those videos in a faster way. For example, a deaf filmmaker would be able to communicate with the deaf director and would understand that it's the right shots. A deaf editor would understand exactly which moments to capture because we all have a shared language. And we all have that instinct between us. And that's important. And we've got so many deaf creatives out there. The mainstream are starting to open up and starting to invite more deaf creatives in. And that's flourishing that talent.
In summary, the 5 key principles we have established are: firstly, to closely follow the chronology of the narrative. This means trusting that Shakespeare gives us what we need when we need it. So we need to meet the witches to set the atmosphere and build anticipation of Macbeth. Then we need to experience the battle as it's described to Duncan. And then we need to hear Duncan's response with his praise of Macbeth, his decision to execute the Thane of Cawdor and reward Macbeth with that title. This order, as Abigail explained, stimulates the audience's theory of mind for them to enjoy the dramatic irony of different characters knowing different things at different times. Our second key principle is using explicit visual resources. Visual aids supported cognitive ease and promoted understanding. We used PowerPoint images to reinforce all ideas, characters, and places. We made resources. Sashes became vital in indicating character and the transferal of power from one person to another. And of course, we had crowns to indicate kings. We also commissioned a storybook image from Jenna Owen, and this came partly from something that Stephen and Becky had done in an exercise in our R&D process, and partly from the conversations that we had had with Helen Chilton about storybooks. This replaced what might otherwise have been a teacher-in-role situation, with the Thane of Ross arriving to tell King Duncan about the battle. Instead, the teacher-in-role, as shown in this image, delivers the storyboard to King Duncan and his court, and the students work out what it says. Our third key principle is using performance techniques and kinesthetic learning. Through inhabiting characters in the play, playing Macbeth, Banquo, Duncan, the witches, etc., we tap into the students' embodied cognition. This includes inhabiting settings, for example, the soldiers in battle, or images of the heath where the witches first meet. In this exercise, students became trees, rocks, birds, and other creatures, and then brought the scene to life in a storm. Our fourth key principle is reinforcing cumulative knowledge and exploring interpretations. We reinforced cumulative knowledge through closed questions, such as who do the witches plan to meet? And we explored interpretations through open questions, such as what do you think it feels like to be in this place? And our last, fifth, very crucial principle was to create short films acted by deaf actors and deaf creatives for deaf students. All the students were highly engaged in watching the bespoke films we created for these key moments in the narrative. And as Charlie was saying, the skilled actors provide role models. They not only support the students' understanding, but inspire them to create their own versions and perhaps raise their aspirations of what they themselves can achieve.
So at the end of the final workshops with both Mary Hare and Elmfield School, we introduced an exercise that was influenced by Helen Chilton's work on writing in role and theory of mind. So the children had been playing Macbeth and Banquo and had just heard the witches' prophecies, which were on film. Immediately after this, we asked them to write letters home to their respective wives. For Elmfield, we introduced another step before this, asking students, in their roles as Macbeth and Banquo, to complete 3 sentences. I feel, I want, and I will. This added step allowed students to share ideas with each other before writing their own letters. And here are some highlights from letters produced by students. As you can see, students in character as Macbeth, already able therefore to understand and attribute feelings to someone else, are able to think that Macbeth might think that Lady Macbeth will be worried about him. So we get, my dear lovely teddy bear, I know you might be worried about me from the battle.
the Signing Shakespeare project. For all of us, it's been a creative journey of learning and discovery. We've begun to explore the issues deaf young people are dealing with in studying Shakespeare, and to trial ways not just to support their understanding of Shakespeare's work, but to develop their social skills and to offer role models in the success and creativity of deaf adults, including deaf creatives.
We had almost completed the set of resources for the whole play of Macbeth when the pandemic halted all activity last March. All but one of the 10 films are completed and most of the accompanying exercises have been devised. But just as we were ready to begin the process of formatting all the resources as a pilot to be hosted on the RSC website, we had to stop. We hope to have those resources available this year and to encourage teachers of the deaf to trial the activities with their students. We hope we are able to follow those trials with research on the impact and efficacy of the work, and then to develop training to support more teachers with deaf and hard of hearing students in their classrooms to work with Shakespeare.
We were very fortunate to be awarded funding from the Billy Rose Foundation in the US to create American Sign Language versions of the core 10 films of Macbeth. As Charlie's explained, American Sign Language differs from British Sign Language. We'd begun putting together a creative team of deaf artists and filmmakers in America, but at present that project's on hold, but we hope it'll get going later in the year. The pandemic has, of course, set us back. But as with so many projects, even before this, we had to balance our ideals with limitations on time and resources. We hope that this project will seed interest so that we can find funding to tip the balance more in favour of our ideals. We hope not only to complete our research on the Macbeth scheme of work, but also to create resources for more plays, this time involving more deaf practitioners, artists and technicians in creating the films and resources. We also hope that our project can promote not just increased deaf awareness, but an appreciation of how deaf artists and young people can bring new ideas and interpretation to working with Shakespeare for us all.
So Abigail was just explaining about the ASL version, which is fantastic. And we want to explore more about what we can achieve with that. Because American deaf culture is very different to British deaf culture. It's not just about a different language or a different sign language. They fingerspell with one hand as opposed to two. And if it's successful, then maybe it will work internationally and we'll be able to set up the project in more places. Also, I really hope that the project we can support that with new plays. Like for Love's Labour's Lost, for example, or Midsummer Night's Dream. We can try and explore different plays and use that process to see what happens and it's successful there. Deaf performers or performers that happen to be deaf can give so much to an audience. They can give so much in terms of visual understanding of the play. And I'm sure a lot of mainstream people who go to the theatre don't understand. And actually having the sign language as a visual interpretation, they can understand more from the language because it's visual. I really hope that there's more deaf creatives involved in the project going forward and from the start as well. And going through that process all the way to the end. So the RSC have started integrated BSL performances where there's an interpreter within the show. Let me explain a bit more. So the interpreter is amongst the performers, not stood on the edge of the stage in the corner where someone might push them off. Oh no. The interpreter is involved right in the midst of the blocking. They're visual, they're part of the same play. So it means that deaf audiences feel part of the performance rather than having to look away from the main centre of the action. The RSC are creating far more performances with integrated interpreters, and it gives us deaf people more choice to enjoy plays. I really hope that going forward, we can continue to develop that relationship and see deaf creators going forward.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you to Angie and to Tracy and to Laura, and enjoy the rest of the festival.